Hey listeners, welcome to the very first Patreon episode of Homegrown KC, a podcast dedicated to exploring Kansas City's history and sharing stories from its rich past. With me is the curator of the Marr Sound Archives at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Library, and Mr. Chuck Haddix. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here with you.
So before we talk about the archives, we just want to hear a little bit about you. Where did you go to school? How did you become a historian?
Well, I'm a self-trained historian. I went to Maple Woods, and then I went to Penn Valley, and then I went to UMKC. I dropped out, went back 20 years later, and then I started working here in 1987. I had on-the-job training. There's no school you go to, at least not in those days, where you become a sound archivist. I've always been interested in records, and so I've been a collector for since I was about 16 years old. I used to collect 45s and LPs back in the day, rock and roll. In 1977, I went to work in the record business. I worked for a company called Friends 2 Music, which was a small label distributor. Well, actually, no, that's not right. Friends 2 was a one-stop. It's a place where small record stores could make one stop and buy everything they need wholesale.
Okay.
Across labels, like we carried RCA Victor, Capitol, Columbia. And I worked with a lot of African-American owners of small shops at that time. And from there, I went to work for House Distributors, which was a small label distributor. We distributed Rounder Records, Flying Fish, labels that didn't have a distribution network would give us records to sell on their behalf. And we worked with some of the bigger stores around the country, and they would come to us for these records they couldn't find anyplace else. Mm-hmm. And then I went to work for Penny Lane Records. I was the manager of Penny Lane Records, first on Warnell, and then when it moved to Broadway. So, and when I was working for Penny Lane, the Westport Trucker and the other alternative weeklies had folded. So we started what we called the Penny Pitch in those days, and then it became the Pitch.
Okay.
And I was a jazz columnist for the Pitch. And then I went to work for the Music Exchange, which was a used record store buying and selling collections. Mm-hmm. And I went back to school because I wanted to make a parallel career move, and I wanted to get into broadcasting. So I studied with Gaylord Marr, who was a professor of communication studies. And Gaylord had this huge collection of sound recordings in his home and in the outbuilding out behind his home in Hyde Park. And we became friendly, and he mentored me. And I went to work for KCUR in 1984 as a jazz producer. And then in 85, I started the Fish Fry. And then when this position came open, I applied for it, and they hired me not because I was a librarian, because I wasn't a librarian. They figured I could establish the collection quicker. Mm. And also that I knew where all the collections in town were, and I knew all the collectors, and I could build the collection.
Sometimes that's the more important aspect.
Yeah, but I got into the history of Kansas City jazz and history in general as a writer. In those days, Jay McShann, Claude Fiddler Williams, Buddy Anderson, and a lot of the jazz legends were alive. Mm-hmm. And I used to hang out at a club on Main Street called Milton's Tap Room in Linwood, Maine. And Milton was an old gangster who had owned clubs in the 1930s. And he told all these fantastic stories about Kansas City and Kansas City jazz. He told all the... Let me back up again. In the early 70s, I started hanging out at a jazz club on Main Street called Milton's Tap Room. Mm-hmm. Milton was an old gangster who had owned clubs during the 1930s in Kansas City, and he told all these fantastic stories. And I wondered if they were true or not. You know, and it sparked my interest.
Sometimes you just don't know if it's a tall tale.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Well, anytime it's a first person narrative, you have to wonder if they're a reliable narrator. And so I began to do research into Kansas City jazz, and I did an interview with Milton Morris that was published in the Pitch. And that was kind of my first serious, piece on history. And then I started hanging out at the Mutual Musicians Foundation after hours. Mm-hmm. And I met all these people like Laverne Barker and all these jazz musicians. And I began, gathering stories from them and interviewing them and just learning about Kansas City jazz from them, about Charlie Parker. And that further sparked my interest.
That must have been amazing.
It was incredible hanging out with these guys. I mean, they would tell me that, I was in my 20s, and they would say, "Oh, you remember so-and-so?" It's like, I wasn't born then. And so that's how I became interested in history, and I got serious. About I guess it would be 97, I got a call from Frank Driggs. And I'd been a consultant on the film Kansas City, and Driggs had put out the real Kansas City, a CD on anthology on the Columbia label, and he'd made some mistakes in his research. And so I contacted him and told him that, there were typos in there too, and told him that about the 1929 session where it occurred, not where he thought it was actually in the Star Building. And so I was at a conference, and he invited me to come visit him in his home in Brooklyn. So I went over to visit Frank, and he had the largest collection of jazz photos in the world. And he'd been collecting for years, and he was quite known to be a great resource. Mm-hmm. And he'd also written extensively about Kansas City jazz, and he had a book contract with Oxford University Press since the 70s to write a history of Kansas City jazz. And we talked for a long time at very high levels about the history of Kansas City jazz and about various people. Mm-hmm. He'd also done oral histories. And he invited me to come aboard and help him write this book. And the Sheldon Meyer, who was the editor at the time, revised the contract and brought me aboard. And Frank knew that the history of Kansas City jazz was in the Kansas City Call, the African-American newspaper. So the Kansas City Call is available on microfilm at the Kansas City Public Library. So I went through the Kansas City Call and made copies of all the music references. And at that time, there's no digital, so I basically made paper copies of it. Mm-hmm. And that told me when things happened. And then I gathered together all the interviews I could find and other printed interviews, recorded interviews with the musicians that were part of the Kansas City scene. And I started, I've been a writer with the Pitch, but I had never written that kind of an ambitious project before. So Frank was not a writer. He was a collector. He didn't write any of it. I wrote the whole thing. And so I started writing and, chapter by chapter and telling the story of Kansas City Jazz. What you're doing is telling the story. And I wrote it to be episodic because, like a screenplay, because the story, as the story unfolds, when Benny Moten leaves town, Andy Kirk comes back, the focus switches to him, and I tell his story. When Charlie Parker comes along. So I'm telling a lot of different stories simultaneously. And that's a real challenge because you have to have a narrative thread to bring the reader through the story. Mm-hmm. And so I finished the second draft, and I thought, oh boy, I'm really hot stuff. And so I showed it to Steve Paul, and he was an editor for the Star, and he said, I don't really see 18th Street. I don't really hear 18th Street. I don't smell it. So I thought, well, maybe a few adjectives would be good. And so I went back in and did a third rewrite on it. And during that third rewrite, I found my voice as a writer. Mm-hmm. That takes time.
It does.
It takes a lot of writing to do it. And when I did the Kansas City book, I wrote 2 chapters on Charlie Parker beyond the chapters in Kansas City in his time afterwards. And in reviewing the literature, I realized that his story had not been told, and a lot of what had been written was inaccurate. There have been a number of biographies written about Charlie Parker, and quite a bit written about him. It was inaccurate. And what was worse is his time in Kansas City had been given really short shrift, which is...
I feel like that's so different from now when he's so celebrated. Is that
right.
all because of your work?
No. He was celebrated before.
Okay.
But the story that had not been told is his time in Kansas City, and it was a major oversight because he spent his first 20 years in Kansas City, and he only lived to be 34 years old. Mm-hmm. So I began to dig deep into Charlie Parker, and I had found all these references to him in the Kansas City Call. And I held some of that research back because I wanted to include it in my book. And rather than contact a publisher, you interested in the book, I just went ahead and wrote it. Mm-hmm. And in the interim, Oxford University Press republished a short bio of Charlie that had been done by a guy in Great Britain. It focused a lot on his music. And so they were not interested in another biography of Charlie Parker, so I approached University of Illinois Press. And I wrote this, 50-page, summation and gave examples of chapters and all that stuff. And the editor just told me, he's an emeritus editor, just send along the manuscript. And so they agreed to publish it. And I did a rewrite on it, and then that came out in 2015.
Okay.
And so, my research is ongoing into both Kansas City jazz and Charlie Parker.
So do you have a manuscript you're working on now?
No, I'm doing. I just finished a chapter on the Coon Sanders Band as a white dance band in Kansas City, mm-hmm. For the University of Kansas Press. It's in an anthology called Wide Open Town, Kansas City in the Pendergast Era. It's also published online. It's part of the Pendergast Era, Kansas City Public Library. Mm-hmm.
I've looked at the hard copy. So yeah. Is there more online than that I should look at?
There's more images online.
Okay.
It's the same chapter. It's an abbreviated version online, but but I was able to. The nice thing about publishing online is, and I'm sure you're well aware of this as a podcast person, you can put up moving image, mm-hmm. audio, and you can really put up a lot more photos. Yeah. And if you make a mistake, you can go back and edit it. You can't with a book. Mm-hmm. I'm considering doing a book on Coon Sanders because their story becomes America's story in the 1920s and 1930s. But right now, I've got a number of projects I'm working on. I'm going to be writing an extended piece for Flatland TV, KCPT, on Charlie Parker as part of the centennial. Mm. That's coming up next year. Mm-hmm. And my Charlie Parker book is being translated and published in Japan.
Congratulations. That's really cool.
That's nice. It's nice to get royalty checks from 2 sources. But it's also nice that a whole new audience will get to read the book. Mm-hmm. And so, I've got little side projects. Now, I'm going to get back to Coon Sanders, but I'm kind of enjoying myself just working on these, on little side projects. And, I work. I'm a curator of the Sound Archive. I do the Fish Fry Friday and Saturday nights on KCUR, and then I've been teaching at the Art Institute on Tuesday nights this semester. So I haven't had much free time. Institute? I teach my book.
Oh, okay.
And Kansas City book. I teach history of Kansas City jazz, and so right now taking a little breather, but I'm really interested in telling Coon Sanders' story. It's just a matter of when I want to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's my next project.
Well, and we've said a couple of times you're the director here, and I'm sure this keeps you busy. So tell us about the Sound Archives.
Well, Sound Archives was established in 1987 with a foundation gift of 34,000 sound recordings by Professor Gaylord Marr. Gaylord was a pioneer of using audiovisual material in the classroom. At the time when he was teaching back in the 80s and 60s and 70s, they had a desk chairs
Chalkboard.
for students, and a chalkboard. So he would bring in cassettes to illustrate the points of his lectures. If he's talking about the Germans' use of propaganda, media for propaganda, he'd bring in broadcasts of Hitler's speeches. If he's talking about, women's changing roles in the 1920s, he'd bring in songs of the suffragettes. And historic, coverage of bombing of Pearl Harbor. And the crash of the Hindenburg is a good example, too, where the reporter's standing there watching the Hindenburg come in, and it breaks up before his very eyes, and he describes it. And it's the immediacy of the media. And since then, the collection has grown to include over 400,000 sound recordings. We have a wide variety of formats, ranging from cylinders to 16-inch lacquer discs that are metal-based with cellulose acetate coating with the signals cut in the surface. One of the strengths of the collection, and part of the collection's most used, is our radio collection. We have over 30,000 of these 16-inch discs. So individuals from all over the world contact us. We were contacted actually by two different individuals from Australia this morning. One wanted information on something in the collection. The other wanted to get copies for his research.
Okay.
And they find us because of two different ways. In our online catalog, Merlin, about 12,000 of discs have been cataloged, and it's a union catalog available to everybody through OCLC. But we also have finding aids that we put up on our websites, and people find those through the internet. So, and if somebody wants to listen to something, we can make it available to them by putting it on our server and make it available as stream media. Or in the case of Ken Burns, for example, when he did his documentary on country music, he wanted to use some material from our collection. So we put it in Dropbox and he just grabbed it.
Okay.
And, we serve the students and the faculty and staff at UMKC, but we serve the broader scholarly community internationally.
That's awesome.
We have people from all over the world coming here to do research. And
so right outside your window here, I see a bunch of old, what is the word I'm looking for here, recording devices?
Yeah, they're old players. Cylinder players, radios, disc players. They're vintage audio equipment. And those are for display purposes. They're quite colorful. We have some that function that we have in the next to the stacks. And when I do tours, we do a lot of group tours and a lot of class tours. I talk about the history of the evolution of recorded sound, and I'm able to play a cylinder
that's so
form.
important to music as a whole, but especially jazz, I think.
Yeah, and it gives them a connection to the recordings. They actually hear them. It's one thing to walk in here, and there's a certain wow factor when you walk in and see a room full of records. But when you hear it, it's a whole other thing. We also have two audio preservation studios and a video preservation studio.
Nice.
Derek Long, who's the head of the Sound Archive now, he came aboard about 3 years ago. He's an audio engineer, so he oversees our preservation program. And when you have a disc like a lacquer that's breaking down, they do break down because they're two different materials. Those two materials expand and contract at different rates according to fluctuation in temperature and humidity. They'll flake off. And open reel tapes are a problem too, particularly those recorded after about 73. When they banned whaling, they stopped using whale oil as a lubricant in open reel tapes, and the new formula proved to be unstable. And they developed what they call sticky shed syndrome, and they shed the black particles on the back of the tape onto the heads, and they gum up. So those are two items that we preserve. And when I first started out, we would preserve them by making an open reel copy onto a stable open reel, and then making a cassette service copy. Of course, we live in the digital age now, so we do things a bit differently. We digitize those recordings as 2496 WAV files. We don't compress our files, and we don't process them. We transfer them flat,
so that it sounds exactly the same.
Yeah, it sounds. We're not
as close as you can get.
As close as you can get, yeah, to the original, and there's no EQ or anything like that. We just do a flat transfer. That gives us a standard. And then, if we want to tweak it, we can copy and tweak the file. And we'll also make an MP3 so that if somebody wants to listen to it remotely, they can. And then, using FTP protocol, we move the files from our studio to the server farms in Columbia, Missouri at MU, in the Ellis Library, and the LSO Library Systems Office. That's the repository for all the digital content that's produced by the university. So there it is kept in the deep archive. It's backed up. It's also backed up here. Because with digital files, you have to have redundancy, because if you lose the information on one server, you can go to the other server and get it. So that's how we preserve our collection. And Derek oversees that, and it's very efficient.
Okay.
The way he got it set up, and it's ongoing. We're also getting ready to get into mass digitization, where you can digitize 10 cassettes simultaneously.
What?
Using multi-tracking.
Okay.
And Derek can tell you more about that. But so we're becoming one of the leaders in preservation of audio also, and we provide access from 9 until 4:30 Monday through Friday, and somebody's in town researcher will come in on the weekend too. So that's basically
stay pretty busy.
Oh yeah.
Do you know if there are any other sound archives in America, or even internationally?
There are a number of sound archives in America. Library of Congress, of course, Stanford.
Oh, of course, I should have thought of
Syracuse.
Library of Congress.
Bowling Green has a very substantial collection too, mostly pop culture. The focus of the collection is the American experience, and we work with all those institutions. But the focus of the collection is the American experience is reflected in recorded sound. And under that kind of big umbrella, we're known for our jazz collections, but we also have a great collection of classical, opera, rock and roll, soul music, blues, Americana. And as a curator, I not only collect sound recordings, I also collect manuscripts and photos. A lot of the jazz archival collections that we have, I have brought into the library because of my ties to that community. And so I work with the other curator, Stuart Hines, on bringing collections in. The audio, we get a lot of mixed media collections, and so the audio stays down here in video, and all the paper material goes to Labuddy Special Collections.
Okay.
And then we create finding aids for the collection. We'll create a finding aid for the collection with a link to the finding aid for our collection and their collection. And they're part of the collection.
Good.
So, we collect, preserve, and make available archival material. And it's interesting the things that people are use. And we have a number of specialty collections. Like, for example, we have the Glamour collection, the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America. We collect.
Oh, that's housed here.
Yeah, it's housed here. Yeah.
Okay.
The audio's here in the paper material upstairs. And we like to collect parts of our society that are not well documented. Like we have the Martha Jane Starr collection.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Martha Jane. You'll have to fill me in here.
Martha Jane was a philanthropist, and she was very active in university life, and she was an advocate for women's rights.
Okay.
And an advocate for women in general. And so we have the Martha Jane Starr collection, which has attracted a collection of a lot of other prominent women in Kansas City. So we have women, the LGBTQ community, and a lot of from the African American community too. Mm-hmm. And so we continue to collect. We just picked up the Kansas City Star clipping files, 900 boxes.
Wow.
Yeah. It's available online, but it's nice to be able to look at
have it. Yeah.
So
let's swing back around to jazz. We've thrown out a lot of names. Who are some of your favorite historic Kansas City jazz musicians?
Of course, Charlie Parker, Jay McShann, Coon Sanders, Bob Brookmeyer. I'm interested in Bob Brookmeyer too. He comes along later. I was friends with a lot of these people, like George Salisbury. Mm. And some of the people like Laverne Barker. I love Laverne Barker, the bassist, played with Andy Kirk and later played with City Light Orchestra. Bobby Watson's one of my favorites today. There's so many of them. I mean, I knew Piggy Minor, who was in Jay McShann's band, and John Jackson, and so they're all gone now. Mm-hmm. I used to hang out with the old guys. Now I am the old guy.
And so in my episode on jazz, I just did like a brief overview. And then at the end, I talked about the guys that I thought were the three most important to Kansas City and helped develop the KC sound. Moten, sorry, I'm blanking.
Basie, certainly.
Basie, thank you. And then Charlie Parker.
Right, yeah.
So would you agree those three are the most important in Kansas City, or are there others that we should?
No, I think they are the most important. Benny was the one, well, Count Basie, when he was a member of the Benny Moten Band, is the one who really defined the Kansas City sound and pioneered that distinctive sound. Mm-hmm. With the rhythm section playing 4 strong beats to the floor and playing in a straight line, the great soloists in the riffing sections. And it's an easy swinging style. In 1932, Eddie Durham and Count Basie wrote a song called Moten's Swing. Mm-hmm. And it anticipates the swing movement by 3 years. Benny Moten was not a good musician. He was a middling pianist, really, but he was a good business person. He knew how to take care of business, mm-hmm. which Basie didn't. And so he's the one that really kind of defines it. And then Charlie Parker is really the culmination of the tradition. He's the one that takes all these influences in the Kansas City style and takes it to another level with bebop. Mm-hmm.
I talked about how he created bebop and then the evolution of bebop into basically all of our modern music.
Oh, one of the reasons I wrote the Kansas City book is that I felt very strongly that Kansas City contribution had been largely overlooked. Mm-hmm. When Ken Burns did his documentary Jazz, they used material from our collection, and I worked with them on that. They interviewed me, and I provided them with resources. And when it came out, there's very little mention of Kansas City. And there's 4 cradles of jazz. Jazz was born in New Orleans, traveled by train to Chicago, and then really came of age in New York and Kansas City. And Kansas City jazz, because it was geographically isolated from these other jazz centers, developed a unique voice in jazz. Mm-hmm. New Orleans is collective improvisation, clarinet, trombone, cornet, and it moves upriver. And Chicago really never is largely derivative of the New Orleans style, because King Oliver and Louis went to Chicago, and they greatly influenced the young white musicians, the so-called Austin High Gang. Mm-hmm. New York jazz is really defined by Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington. It's an orchestral expression of jazz. Kansas City is a whole other thing. And Ross Russell had written a book on Kansas City jazz called Jazz in Kansas City and the Southwest. And he kind of made it up. He didn't really do his research. And then he's also a biographer of Charlie Parker. And Jazz Style in Kansas City and the Southwest was controversial when it came out because there's so many inaccuracies in it. Mm. And he got it so wrong. So I decided, when I given the opportunity to work with Frank to write this book, I decided I'm going to do it right. Mm-hmm.
I think I found that book in the Southwest and looked through it briefly, but the other sources that I was looking at were, I felt, more informative, so I didn't really use that much.
Yeah, it's not very well. I've looked at the Ross Russell collection, University of Texas at Austin, and he didn't do much research for it. He actually, well, it's kind of funny because he used Frank's research. Frank had published a whole series of articles and interviews. Mm-hmm. And Frank, these jazz critics really can't stand each other. Frank didn't like Ross Russell. Martin Williams hated everybody. Frank resented Russell because Russell beat him to the punch on writing about Kansas City jazz, and he didn't do it right, and he used a lot of Frank's research.
Yeah.
So I felt it imperative to tell Kansas City's story. I mean, it's a little chauvinistic of me because I'm from Kansas City and I'm a booster, but because I'm from Kansas City and I knew all these people, I was able to do it.
You know it better, yeah.
Yeah, and also nobody had bothered to go through the call. That's where the story is. Mm-hmm. That and the Journal Post and the Star too. All these clubs advertised in the Star, mm-hmm. and they did cover the local scene. So that's available now online. It wasn't available online when I did the Kansas City book. I did a lot with the Journal Post, and the person that really influenced me was Dave Dexter Jr. Dexter wrote for the Journal Post in the 1930s, and he wrote for Downbeat and Metronome, and that was one of the first collections that I brought in, big collections I brought in, prestigious collection was the Dave Dexter collection. Okay. And I got to know Dexter, and Dexter, we talked on the phone regularly, and I met him when I moved the collection. And Dexter encouraged me, and he'd written about Kansas City jazz. Russell drew from him quite a bit too. He never wrote a book on Kansas City jazz, but he wrote the first history of jazz. Okay. And so Dexter inspired me to become a writer and inspired my research into Kansas City jazz too. And I was able to draw from his collection too when I did the Kansas City book.
Awesome.
So I had vast resources to draw from. Mm-hmm. That's what you have to have when you're telling a big story like that.
Yeah, definitely. Let me see if I had any other questions or things I wanted to talk to you about. No, I think we had everything that I had thought of. Are there any other books or sources you would recommend for our listeners if they want to learn more?
About Kansas City jazz? Mm-hmm. Going to Kansas City, Nathan Pearson, Howard Litwack. That
was a good one. I really enjoyed that one.
They also inspired me because I was working in the record business in 1980, and when they came to do the Going to Kansas City exhibit, Mid-America Arts Alliance sponsored it. Mm-hmm. And they put out a little booklet, and they did a series of concerts in the park. And I got to know Howard, and and Nathan. They did interviews. They interviewed a lot of the musicians who were around in those days, and that's something I was remiss in. I used to talk to them. I didn't really interview them on tape. Mm-hmm. I just talked to them and remembered what they told me. Where they came in with tape machines and they interviewed people, but they weren't very good interviewers at times. There's a real art to interview, and you have to let people tell their story. You know how to do that, I can tell, because of our conversation.
Oh, no, this is the first time, so, thank you, but...
No, you know how to do it. And so they inspired me also in my research in Kansas City jazz, and I recommend their book, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of antecedents and, little clips of the musicians in their own words. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, well, you have to let them tell their story. When you're interviewing, you ask the question, and then you just let that person roll. Mm-hmm. I also had access to Frank. Frank interviewed a lot of musicians over the years. We have his oral histories here, too.
Is he no longer with us?
No, Frank's gone, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, did you inherit his photograph collection?
No, his photograph collection went to Jazz at Lincoln Center. I tried to get it. He gave us his oral history collection when he was still alive, but after he passed, the attorneys in charge of his estate negotiated with Jazz at Lincoln Center to sell his collection.
Okay.
And so they bought his collection. Unfortunately, it's not available.
Oh, that is unfortunate.
For some reason, they don't make it available to researchers. I think one of the reasons probably is that Frank's collection was copies of other original photographs, not the original photographs.
Oh, so there might be a copyright issue.
Yeah, the copyright rights issues come up with that. Yeah, so he had a fabulous collection of photographs, though. When you look at Ken Burns' jazz, that's all Frank Driggs.
Okay.
And, I was able to draw from the Driggs collection just right after he passed for images for my Charlie Parker biography, fortunately. But, we don't, for the Japanese version, we're using different images than from him.
Okay. Will this be the first time that your book's been translated into another language?
Yes, it is. A guy in Brazil was interested in translating, but that never came to fruition.
So I'm curious then, why Japanese? Is jazz really big over in Japan?
Jazz is very big in Japan. There was a young man named Chio who translated a book on Bird in Canada, talking about jazz at Massey Hall and his involvement in Canada. And he approached me about translating the Bird book. He's a Charlie Parker nut, And
Okay.
so I put him in touch with my publisher, and they said, we don't, he wanted to translate as an individual. We want to work with a publisher in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So he referred them to a publisher in Japan. And so, it's being translated, and it'll be published there for the centennial. I'm always looking toward. I'm interested. I'm studying the past, but I look towards the future with my projects. And recently, I've been in touch with a jam pole and a guy named Jesse Nacita represents Charlie Parker's estate. And I just recently wrote a biography of Bird, a short biography of Bird for the website. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to be working on a centennial committee for the celebration of Charlie Parker here in Kansas City next August. And I'm going to write a piece on Bird in Kansas City. Mm-hmm. Not only some new research I've come up with since my book was published, but also, the times that he would return to Kansas City. There's this myth. One of the difficult things of writing about Charlie Parker is he's so wrapped in myth. There's so much myth around him. You have to strip that away to get to his story and the truth of his story. And so I'm going, one of the myths is that, he was not appreciated in Kansas City. He didn't want to go back to Kansas City. He didn't want to be buried in Kansas City. That's not the case. He was a big star in Kansas City. Everybody knew Bird. I mean, he was billed as saxophonist supremus when he was playing with the Harlan Leonard Band. And he often returned to Kansas City when he would travel, when he would be on tour. He would stop in Kansas City on his way back to New York City where he lived. And he would play at the El Capitan and also at Tootie's Mayfair and spend time with his mother and friends in Kansas City. So I'm going to talk about not only his time in Kansas City, but also his relationship with Kansas City after he broke out internationally.
Okay.
So I'm going to do that. And the nice thing about publishing online is, I can put audio up there, more images. And since the book was published, I've come across a lot of new information on Bird and images, and I want to make that available to people.
Nice.
As part of the centennial.
So I know the centennial is usually a big deal. It's like a month long. There's stuff going on. Do you have any idea? I know it's kind of early, but any idea of what some of it that might be?
Well, I think the centennial is going to be celebrated all year long.
Okay.
But it'll be a 10-day celebration here in Kansas City. There'll be panel discussions. There'll be I'll do presentations, walking tours of 18th and Vine, talking about where Bird played.
I wanted to go to
concerts.
That so bad this year, and I think I had to work or something that day.
Yeah, there's concerts. There'll be concerts, and it's going to be we're going to celebrate Bird in Kansas City, and the Jam Pole who administers the rights to Charlie Parker's music for the estate is coordinating in New York celebration, also the celebration in Los Angeles and in Kansas City, and in October there's going to be a workshop on the music of Charlie Parker at the Kaufman Center with Delfeo Marsalis, working with students and teaching them the elements of bebop and the history of Charlie Parker. And Johnson County Community College is also going to do something. And of course, the American Jazz Museum. I'm talking to the American Jazz Museum now about possibly doing a display on Charlie Parker.
Okay.
To do an exhibit, maybe that could travel.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of things coming up next year, and then after that's all done, I think I'll probably set my sights on Coon Sanders and tell their story.
Yeah.
I would really like to do that.
Sounds very exciting.
But I've got to have the space to do it right now.
Sounds like you're far too busy right now.
I am, but I love my wife and like to spend time with her too.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy my downtime. Let's put it that way.
All right. Well, unless there's something else you really want to talk to us about, I think that's it.
Well, Lauren, it's been a pleasure sitting here and talking to you.
Thank you so much.
And I hope that you found some good things to put in your podcast.
Oh, yeah. Listeners, that'll be the end for today. Thank you for joining us. For more information, make sure you visit the website, homegrownkc.wordpress.com. I'm all over social media as homegrownkc. So please make sure to like, follow, and subscribe on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. Thank you for your support. It's very appreciated. Everything you guys give me goes back into the show. And as usual, thanks goes out to my sister-in-law, Sarah McCombs, for designing the logo, to the Dear Misses for the use of their song as the intro and outro music of the show, and to my local library, without whom I would have not been able to complete this research. Also, special thanks goes out to Chuck. It was so amazing to talk to him. He knows so much. I really want to have him on the show again at a later date. He showed me around the sound archive after the interview. It has thousands of records. They have several different record players and what's the word I'm looking for? Nope, it's not coming to me. Whatever the older version of a record player is, something phone. And they work, and I got to listen to the records with these machines. It was just so cool. That's all for today. Thank you for joining us as we explore this piece of Kansas City history.
Seem to shake this feeling, and I can't seem to get you off my mind. Thought I lost my nerve forever, and I know that it's now or never to try and see this through. Tie loose ends up with a bow and start anew. We could talk through the nights on the phone, but we toss and we turn all alone, and we both know that that's not the